Looks like we're starting. So welcome today to the Brown Bag Lunch. The Gender Equity Initiative of the ABAA is sponsoring this talk, usually every once a month. And thank you, everybody, for coming and taking your lunch break with us. We're super excited today. We have Jim Owens of Thorn Books, who's going to talk about the invention and demise of the Victorian bookcloth. I'm super excited to hear about that. I will give you Jim's bio, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jim. Here we go. So we got Jim Owens, Thorn's Books. Jim Owens, an associate member of the ABA and principal at Thorn Books with his wife, Lynne Owens, who's been a full member since 1987. Jim's educational journey is a testament to his intellectual curiosity. With an undergraduate degree from St. Mary's of Moraga in philosophy, Latin, English, and vertebrate zoology. That's pretty impressive. Jim also has a doctorate of jurisprudence from Ventura College of Law and has been involved in many volunteer works in public radio and television and for the Postal History Museum Foundation in Tucson, Arizona. Beyond his professional pursuits, Jim's interests span a wide range from bookbinding and restoration to gardening and playing the organ and harp. Wow, that is. I'm going to remind everybody, if you haven't been to one of our brown bag lunches, you can either raise your hand on Zoom, and if you have a question for Jim, after he is done, we can bring you live and unmute you. Or you can just ask the question in chat and I can ask the question to Jim for you. So we are ready. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, and greetings from Southern Arizona. I want to thank you and the Brown Bag Initiative for this opportunity for me to talk about one of my loves, Victorian bookcloth. I've been involved in it for some 35 years now, thanks to Donald Bessick, the late Donald Bessick, who was a book interesting fellow, by the way, from Lancashire. He was great friends with Bernard Middleton. He was also great friends with Dame Hildebeth Cumming, the master printer of the Stanbrook Abbey Press. He was a chorister in the Royal Albert Hall under Sir Thomas Beecham. But
his computer. There we go.
Okay, I'll pick up where I left off.
Okay,
During
great.
the war, Donald was a Benedictine Anglican monk, and in that capacity, he learned monastic bookbinding. He also introduced Lynn and me to Bill and Dorothy Tomlinson, who were players in the bookcloth story. More about them later. So getting on to bookcloth, I think the first question I want to address is why? Why do we have Victorian bookcloth? Why do we have bookcloth at all covering books? And as far as nomenclature is concerned, Victorian bookcloth is a starch-filled cloth that was invented about the time Victoria took the throne, and it lasted just a little bit longer than she did. And during her heyday, it had its heyday. So I've come up with 6 things that happened in the early part of the 19th century that all had a bearing on bookcloth. The first one is the rise of the English school system, where church schools, dame schools, private schools were starting to be funded by the state, and suddenly huge numbers of people were able to read and write. The literacy rate in Britain went from below 50% to about 80% during this time period. And having learned how to read, people wanted books, they wanted periodicals, and this presented an issue for the publishing industry. This is number 2. The book publishers wanted to find a way to meet this demand. And the history's light shines upon Sir William Pickering, who was with the Pickering publishing house in London. Sir William wanted to make books cheaply and ready to go off the shelf. The cheap part was easy. He was going to publish Greek and Roman author translations, long dead English writers, so there was easy, no royalties. Having a book ready off the shelf was sort of going to be a problem because remember, at this time, publishers sort of put books into flimsy little bindings, barely sewn, maybe covered in paper with a spine title. They were never intended to be a permanent binding. People who bought them took them straight to their bookbinder, had them bound up in leather or marbled paper, and that's fine. The new readers coming along didn't have bookbinders. They were not particularly wealthy. So what Sir William wanted to do was find a way to make books ready to go right off the shelf at a low expense. Unfortunately, and now we're at number 3, there was a great rag shortage about this time. And I did say rags. Um, you remember in the beginning of the first millennium, when paper was invented in China, they used members of the mulberry family. They cut them, they boiled them, they stripped them, they beat them, and eventually they got down to the fibers that made up the plant and turned these into paper. Mulberry fibers are amongst the longest in the world, and they made a lock, a very strong lock. They made good paper, and they could make strong, thin paper. Even today, people who repair books look to Asian paper for repair purposes. Well, when this hit England in what, the 14th, 15th century, they used the flax plant. And it didn't take paper makers very long to realize that linen cloth was already partially processed. And even more, people discarded their clothes and other textiles when they were worn, including linen, and the rag makers bought them and provided them to the paper makers very, very cheaply. Linen makes a beautiful paper. Just think about the books from the 17th, 16th century you've seen. It's a gorgeous cream colored paper. So when there's a shortage of rags, there's a shortage of paper, and that is a problem for the publishing industry, especially in the face of this huge demand. So we get to number 4, and his name is Archibald Leighton. Archibald, I always thought he was from Edinburgh, but Andrea Krupp in her book says he was a London bookbinder, and I will bow to her authority. She is a wonderful person, and she knows what she's talking about. Well, Archibald wanted to find a way to bind books that was cheap, not leather. Leather was pricey. So he started experimenting, and at some point, he decided to take window pane or window shade cloth, which is a thin cotton muslin, and he would soak it in a solution involving starch. Then he would pull it out, he would dry it, he would iron it, and to his great happiness, he found that he had a thin cloth with a nice shiny surface, and it would even take tooling, gilt tooling. Well, when the publishers found out about this, they issued a couple books in the subject and all of that, and they were, I have to tell you, an instant failure. I don't know if it's because the public wasn't ready for a cloth covered book, or it's because the only color it seemed to come in was this sort of brownish tan color, and it was ugly. Didn't go anywhere. So the next problem, the next thing, I think we're now at number 5 on our list, chemists. People were working very hard to find ways to make paper without using linen or cotton. They tried everything. The literature of the period is a fascinating read. All these exotic plants you can think of, agaves, esparto grass, everything they tried didn't work. They even tried wood pulp. And the result was either the paper fibers were too thin, so the paper just fell apart, or it wasn't white. And in the case of wood pulp, it was sort of a dark brown color. Think about a grocery bag or a craft wrapping paper. They didn't get anywhere, but chemists came to the rescue. Somebody started to work with chlorine. It had been discovered, about 50 years earlier, maybe 40 years earlier. Someone discovered chlorine bleach. A little bit after that, Somebody decided that try it on fabrics, and they found out it would bleach fabrics white. So now someone decided to add chlorine bleach to the wood pulp, and that turned it into a white enough paper. I'm not going to get involved with the deficiencies of wood pulp paper and the acidic issues and all that. Just remember that at this point in time, suddenly paper was made available again. So all that remained was to try to figure out some way to bind those books up, and now they were focused on a starch-filled cloth. We don't know exactly who did what, and we're not even sure when it was done. But I have to tell you, everything is sort of guesswork after the fact. But somebody around this time period, and we're talking about the early 1820s, somebody decided to take Archie's system of starch, and they started to use a white cotton muslin made from American cotton. They added pigment to the vat that had the starch in it. They used colanders. Now, let's colanders. Let me talk about those. They looked at the dressmakers.
Hey, what's up?
People in the dressmaking industry had been using colanders. We would call them rollers, heavy rollers that had engraving on them, and they would run them through these rollers, and they would come out on the other side with some embossing.
Mm-hmm.
This is sometimes called ribbon cloth, because ribbon cloth was actually this kind of a cloth that was trimmed along lines to make ribbon.
Oh, I see.
Once they decided to use these colanders, and by now they were heating them with steam. When they took their white muslin, dipped it into the colored starch solution, up through the engraved colanders and out the other side, came out ready to go. Now, they call that ribbon cloth, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But before we do, I'll just show you what I'm talking about. This is an example of what I would call ribbon cloth. And you can see there's parallel lines there. These lines were cut down by shaft afterwards and made into ribbon. There were all sorts of varieties of it. There's another one. And here is another one. I always thought that ribbon cloth was the earliest cloth, but I was wrong. The earliest cloth, or certainly one of the earliest cloths, has turned out to be a watered silk. I don't know if you can see it here, but you see how it reflects just like watered silk. This is the Winterbottom pattern. Let's see. This is the S pattern, I think, for silk. Now, at this point, I have to talk a little bit about the references. The first references we have are books about bookbinding. Now, they started to appear around this period of time. They were sort of scarce. That's mostly because bookbinders felt that what they knew was their business and nobody else needed to know it. But they started to talk about you could cover books with leather, marbled paper, and now cloth. Our standard literary research tools, and I'm talking about Carter, Jacob Blank, Michael Sadler, all talk about book cloth. They give photographs of some of the grains. They tell you what the grains are. But this is mostly to help you identify what kind of a book you have, what state it might be in, or something like that. The first breakthrough in the history of book cloth was the book by Bill Tomlinson, and it's called Bookcloth. Bill told me that photographs of the grains were fine, but that he felt that you really needed original samples that you could feel and see exactly what that grain is all about. So he said that he had enough samples to make 1,500 copies of the book. He also had enough tea grain book cloth. This is a Victorian book cloth. It's called a tea grain. It's also called a ribbed cloth. He had enough red to make 1,000 copies, and he had enough blue to bind 500 copies. He was going to have the blue made available for England and the British Commonwealth, and the red for the rest of the world. And there's some things about this book I want to tell you. Bill started his life cutting out pieces of cloth for the Winterbottom Book Company in Manchester. He became a salesman. Then after the war, when Victorian Bookcloth was out of fashion and little binderies were closing down, Bill was there. He bought all of their surplus. And when he retired, he and his lovely wife, Dorothy, started to sell tools and bookcloth and the other equipment to craft bookbinders. The story of bookcloth in Bill's book is also the story of the Winterbottom Book Company. And that, in many ways, that the two just dovetail together, because Archibald Winterbottom, there's another Archie for you, had been an employee of the Bannerman Cloth Company. And during his period there, he experimented with bookcloth. He actually won a bunch of awards at exhibitions for the cloth that he produced. And later he started an official bookcloth company. Now, Bill told me that when he was writing his book, he had to guess at some of the things that Winterbottom did, because Winterbottom at all periods was either the best producer of bookcloth in England and the US. Sometimes it was the only producer of bookcloth because it had a penchant for either buying the competition or putting it out of business. Well, Bill guessed at what was going on. And just as he was finishing his manuscript, one of his friends called. A friend knew Bill was writing a book about bookcloth. Actually, all of Bill's friends knew he was writing a book about bookcloth. And the friend said that the heirs of the Winterbottom Company had decided to give the archives to the Bodleian, and would Bill mind storing them for a while until they could be taken to Oxford. Well, Lynn and I happened to be visiting Bill and Dorothy at the time, and Bill was like a kid in a candy store. He was going through those archives and finding out that what he had guessed at was correct, and he was busily rewriting his manuscript. Unfortunately, he died suddenly of cardiac arrest. His wife, Dorothy, enlisted a man named Masters to help her finish the manuscript, and I guess he did enough work to warrant being called the joint author. Dorothy and her son Andrew marketed the book, and it sold well briefly. Only a few hundred copies, I don't know how many, but the limitation was originally going to be 1,500 copies. That's how many samples Bill had, that's how much bookcloth he had. When sales stopped, Dorothy sold the blue ribbed cloth to a bindery in Canterbury and pieces of it to some other bookbinders. Later, she sold the unbound sheets and the samples to Bob Fleck at Oak Knoll, who finished up the binding and made them available for sale. As far as I know, all copies are in red cloth because the blue cloth was sold. And that makes me wonder if there were actually 1,500 copies, probably only 1,000. So that's Bill. This is an important book in its own way, but it has its limitations. It focuses very much on Winterbottom, and it has some 66 patterns in it, which are very good and all of that. But now we come up with a true monument. In the papers of the Bibliographic Society of America, Andrea Krupp wrote this article on bookcloth. Bill might have changed his mind about photographs if he had seen Andrea's. Andrea combined all of the predecessors. She anguished over what to do about what names to give the bookcloth. There was choice between a descriptive name or an arbitrary name. Winterbottom had S cloth and tea grain and all of that. These were arbitrary. Other people called them rib cloth or moray, pebble, something like that. Andrea came up with a whole brand new classification system. And I will tell you that not long after that came out, Oak Knoll printed it as a standalone title, and to everyone's great delight, all of the illustrations are in color now. Andrea has a couple of things going here. First of all, she has illustrations of the various grains. She has used her system in order to identify them. She investigated books bound in the cloth and tried to use the dates of the book to figure out when the cloth first appeared and when it was stopped using. And that's probably as good as it gets. Furthermore, she identified hundreds of different varieties of cloth. She looked at the library company's vast collection of books in bookcloth. She also investigated the Tomlinson collection, which is now in Bryn Mawr, and other collections. This is a monumental work. It's Homeric, and we had only thank her. I want to disagree a little bit with something that she said, and that has to do with ribbon cloth. And I understand what she's doing and why she's doing it. I showed you some examples of ribbon cloth. Uh, Here's another one. I always thought this cloth was actually used to make ribbons. But it turns out that there are other cloths that have floral qualities in them that dressmakers used. And so we have two ways of talking about ribbon cloth. Ribbon cloth that was probably used, or at least based on what was probably used in the actual making of ribbons, or cloth that was generically used to emboss cloth that was used for dressmaking. And that is what Andrea wants to do. These patterns, they're all sort of diagonal, but they can be geometric, they can be floral, they can be all sorts of things. And she wants to call them all ribbon cloth. And I suppose once we agree on that, we agree. I'm not sure if this is one that she was thinking about, but this is the sort of a kind of a thing we're talking about. See, it's a beautiful floral design. The whole point is, what are you going to call these things? And she decided to call them ribbon, ribbed, moire, pebble grain, sand grain, based on their looks. Now, going back to moire, she found not just one. I think Bill had two examples in his book. She's got half a dozen in hers, and including, say, something like this, which is clearly a moire. I hope you can see the pattern. And it's not exactly the same as the other one I showed you. This one she calls sort of like a snail pattern. There, you see. This is still another one. You can see that the pattern is slightly different. Now, these patterns were created by engraving on one of the colanders. She also discovered that before they engraved that pattern on the colanders, and the pattern, by the way, the engraving, the lines go from thick to thin to thick to thin and make this sort of a whorl design and all of that. And the thickness and thinness of the lines give the impression of being watered silk. But even before that, she found that there is a cloth that it was a ribbed cloth. It was two pieces at once were put into the colander. The colander was not even engraved. The pieces were put in, and where they hit the ribbing, they either crushed it or they didn't, depending on where the ribbing was. Well, this is something she's calling true moire. And I think she gives it a beginning date of 1829. Well, I have to tell you, I didn't realize this until I pulled this book for our little chat today. This book is actually printed in 1823, which is extremely early for bookcloth, because all of the sources suggest that Archibald Leighton was doing his experiments in 1823. And yet here we have a book printed in 1823 in this so-called early design of bookcloth, with all the lines are the same thickness. And yet they still managed to come up with this embossed quality. There were other kinds of cloth. Ribbed cloth was ubiquitous. They had leather, a straight grain Morocco type of cloth. We also had pebble grain. And here's the diaper pattern. This is a very early cloth too. And here's another example of a diaper pattern. You see how shiny the cloth is when it was new? Beautiful. I mustn't forget, here's a linen pattern. See, it resembles linen. All of this is produced by those heated colanders. Now, they also produced a slightly heavier cloth on buckram, smooth. There's all sorts of colors, you see? They're all smooth. It's heavy duty. They used it for law books, dictionaries, etc. And people accepted this. Now, I have to tell you that it wasn't long before publishers found out that they could start drawing little designs on the cloth in gilt. By the 1840s, we had, this is a pebble grain cloth, which is gilt and black. So they found out that the cloth can also hold printing ink. I don't know if it's formulated the same as regular printing ink or not. I have a feeling it's thicker somehow. And we have here, this is a pebble grain cloth, heavily decorated in gilt. Here we have the ubiquitous ribbed cloth, and it was used, it seemed to be one of the favorites. Good old Lafcadio Hearn, and you see, we now have a nice decoration and some color. Well, this just kept going on and on. Here is, well, I'll get to that in a minute. By the end of the century, you had very colorful cloths. This is a ribbed cloth. I'll show you the back first so you can see the grain in the cloth. Ribbed with sort of a moire approach to it. But on the front, we now have a painting. Blue and white and black. This brings us to the close of the 19th century. Bookcloth was in for good, and it was an artist's treasure. Money was being spent to make the cloth very attractive to the buyer. Sometimes it was a little bit over the top. This is I have to call it a floral pattern of some kind. It's very busy, and it's the gilt on it. But you see how busy that pattern is? It's a little bit too much, isn't it? Now, we're at the end of the century, and we're at the beginning of the end of bookcloth. What happened to it, and why? By the way, this is a sand grain. There's also a silk grain. This is a pebble grain. See, it looks like pebbles. Andrea found out there are all these different sized pebbles, all these different sizes of sand and all that. And they even had some specialty claws. How about snakeskin? By the beginning of the 20th century, people's taste started to change. They were looking for not quite so much design and all that. Something simpler would work. You saw more and more bookcloths. Maybe they would use a rib design, or a pebble design, but not big old floral designs anymore. And that was the beginning. That was one of the reasons why Victorian bookcloth just sort of went away. The second reason, and a big one, was water. Water is the big enemy of starch-filled cloth. You get water anywhere close to it, and before you know it, uh, you've got a stain, and it won't go away. It just dissolves the finish. You've all seen book cloth that has little spots on it, maybe. Well, it's because maybe it was in a rain shower, maybe somebody just sprinkled water on it. Or you might see the ubiquitous ring stain. I think it's there somewhere. Well, a cup or a glass got set on this. It had a little bit of moisture on it. It dissolved the starch. You can't do anything about that. So working with book cloth was tricky. Didn't bother the big producers that much because they set up and calibrated their machines. And the cloth went in one end and came out as a book cover on the other end, and it was all automated. But the poor craft booksman who was covering books by hand, I have to tell you, if he's sitting there pasting a piece of cloth up and it shifts, and some of that happens to hit the waste paper he's pasting on, and the adhesive gets underneath onto the side of the cloth that's going to show, well, he may as well start over because the chances of him fixing that are not very good. If it was a starch-based paste that he was using that's high water content, now he has little chance of solving that. If it's PVA, PVA, well, PVA, archival PVA is what's used anymore these days. There's a chance that with his thumbnail after it was dry, but not much. So water was the enemy, and it happens about this time, or maybe a little earlier. The chemical industries were coming up with waterproof cloth. Waterproof cloth tended to be more plain, didn't take the embossing the way the Victorian starch-filled cloth did, but if you made a mistake, you could just wipe it off with water. Didn't make any difference. Another thing was the rise of plastics. This is number 3. Plastics now either could be put into the cloth or they could be applied to the cloth. They could be given a design and all that. They're typically used to make leather grains, and we even have them today, full leather. They're plastic based. They're waterproof. Again, you make a mistake, you can wipe it off. I think the next thing was probably the biggest, and it's the rise of the dust jacket. Dust wrappers were known from the early 1800s, just little ways to protect books when they were shipped. They were discarded when they went into the bookshop, but soon they started to print titles, then some artwork, and by the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century, dust jackets were in full color, or close to it. They were truly works of art. And World War I, World War II probably were the two things that killed the whole idea. Dust jackets reigned supreme. The cloth on the book, nobody looked at much anymore. You could have it. In World War I, they found they could just put a cloth spine on a book and maybe paper boards. In World War II, the whole thing could be covered in paper. Today, when you buy a book, you can look at it. You see a brand new book and it's covered in textured paper and it's not cloth at all. But the dust jacket is there, it's colorful, and the dust jacket is what it goes for. So that was what happened to Victorian book cloth. It was because it was starch filled that it was always a problem. Waterproof took its place, and now cloth is pretty much gone in its entirety. And having said all of that, I guess I can address a question that I had about how to maintain and clean the cloth. And I'll give you a couple of tidbits on it. There are about 4 different ways you can clean a Victorian book cloth. And I have to tell you, none of them are very successful, in my opinion. However, the first thing you want to do, if you want a fixed piece of cloth, the corners, they wear. The spine tips, the weakest part of a book binding. People they want to pull the book off the shelf by sticking their finger in here. It starts to wear. Shelf wear. Here, this one is worn just a little bit at the bottom. What you want to do for something like this is, this is a honey bottle. It's perfect. It holds my polyvinyl acetate, my PVA, archival PVA. You get some of that. You can get them at art stores. You just put a little bit on your finger and touch the offending area to get those strands to lie back down and give them strength so they don't keep fraying. Have a little paper towel or something with you and wipe off any excess. And that's what you can do to keep these things in good shape. As far as cleaning them, well, the safe way is to use a dry, clean cloth or a paper towel and just wipe the book. The surface dust is going to come off. The towel is going to show that. The book isn't going to look much better, but it's something. It might help. Number two would be this thing is called a document cleaning pad. I think it comes from Bird Art. Other places have it too. It's a sack, and it's filled with powder. And the powder, I think, is made from ground up erasers. So basically, it's a dry process. Again, no moisture at all. So you can sit there and you can rub the book. And I got to tell you, the first time you do it, the cloth gets dirty. There's nothing you can do about that. And the powder falls out all over the place. And maybe the book looks better, maybe it doesn't. I'm not too thrilled about it. There is, I'm told, a paste that is specific to cleaning book cloth. Some people swear by it. I think I've tried it years ago. I don't know what it's called. I don't know where you can get it. I was not impressed. It tended to streak. I don't know. It's very tricky to use, and book cloth is just tricky to deal with. The starch-filled book cloth is. Okay, here are the two dangerous ways. First thing you want to do before you even think about cleaning what you think is Victorian book cloth, especially if it's a simple design like this ribbed design. You want to take a Q-tip or something with a little bit of moisture, a little bit of distilled water. I suppose you can use tap water or bottled water, and just run it along the bottom edge and see if you get color. If you get color on your Q-tip, you're dealing with starch-filled cloth because the color is coming off. It's dissolving. If you don't get any color, get another Q-tip, do the same thing on the other. If you still don't get any color, then you have a waterproof cloth, and you can use a very lightly dampened cloth to wipe it, and you're home free. If you have color coming off, you have starch-filled cloth, and this is what you could do. Success rate is not great, but you could take a damp cloth, and when I say damp, I mean so dry you have to touch it twice to see if it has any moisture in it at all. Very, very lightly moist. And you take the back. I always like to start in the back because if you're going to have a problem, that's where you want the problem to be. And you take your cloth, wipe it very carefully all over, and then you keep rubbing, rub, because it's not so much, and you do it lightly. You're drying it, and you're trying to dry it evenly so it doesn't streak. You go backwards and forwards and round, and you'll see the shine come back up when you do this. And with any luck, you'll get your dirt off. I don't find that very successful either. The one that gives me the best success rate is also the most dangerous, is the use of spray wax. I used to use Johnson & Johnson. Now I tend to like Guardsman. It gives me better results. And the same thing, start on the back, just give it a quick dollop, and with your cloth, quick as a wink, you get that wax spread out all evenly. You can't afford to let it sit just in one spot. Then you keep rubbing. Rub. And as you rub, you'll slowly see the shine come back and it dries. And if you do it right, and you make sure you're even and you're rubbing everywhere, you'll have a nice even thing. You won't get any streaks or anything like that. If you're successful here, turn it over and do the front. Comes to the spine, I don't put new, my cloth is already moist with the spray wax. And the spine is going to be tricky anyway, because so many of these books were in libraries where there was smoke from candles or lamps or cigars or pipes. They have things have settled on them, residue. And the spines could be sunned because that's what's sitting out with a light. I don't know if you're going to get much good result, but you can try. I have the best result when I don't put anything else on the cloth, I just use the cloth as it is. It's only slightly moist, and I just rub it quickly over the spine. No pressure, just that way, and see what happens. You got to be careful, because if you rub very much, number one, you're taking a little microscopic layer of color off. So that's why it looks better. But you could also be taking some of the printing ink off, and you might actually lose it. The title may just disappear on you. So it's dangerous, but if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. The bottom line probably is just use a dry cloth, wipe it, and that's it. And with that, I want to say thank you for this opportunity. I got to talk about book cloth, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. And I hope that maybe I have given you something to think about if you don't know much about cloth, maybe some introduction. If you do, maybe I've given you something new. So thank you.
Thanks so much. I learned a lot. Sorry about that technical difficulties. I'd never run my show before, so she didn't have to talk me through it. Does anybody have any questions in the chat thing, or if you want to raise your hand? I actually have a quick question. When was the first sighting of faux leather?
Faux leather?
Yeah, like
according to Andrea, let's see, we have a Morocco pattern from 1833. Oh, here's a fine straight grain Morocco. I think I showed you an example of that. That's the straight grain Morocco. She shows this as 1831. And okay, one thing about Andrea's book, which I think is wonderful, is she gives beginning and ending dates based on the books that she has examined. So for the earliest, we have a straight grain Morocco, 1831, and the last example she found was 1854.
Okay.
And see, I don't know if I showed you this, but she has this chart in the book. Not only does it have her number on it and the dates of when she found these things, but she also coordinates with all of the predecessors and gives their particular numbering or lettering system, so you can cross-reference.
And that's the Oak Knoll book?
This is the Oak Knoll book, and as far as I know, it's still in print.
Oh, that was the second question, was that a limited edition?
No, I believe it's in print today, and I think the price is $35.
That's awesome. I've got a question from Megan Bell from Underground Books. Can you speak to trends in collecting publishers' cloth bindings over the years in the trade?
Soft bindings?
No, can you speak to trends in collecting publishers' cloth bindings over your years in the trade?
I cannot. I mean, people do. I mean, especially covers. Think about Lafcadio Hearn's covers, or well, Margaret Armstrong comes to mind. Yeah, people collect them all, but you're going to find, I think, you're going to find a couple of different kinds of people. They're going to look for the glory years, which would be probably just around World War I, a little bit before World War I. Or you're going to find people that just want to collect all the way back as far as they can go. And of course, that would involve the actually book cloth. And that would be a present time that would start with 1823. I've never done that. I'm purely a book cloth guy.
Kathy Judge is asking, what's the difference between publisher's binding and Victorian bookcloth bindings?
Well, they're connected. During the period of time we're talking about, from 1823 and on, the Victorian bookcloth was the publisher binding.
Okay.
But then, of course, after Victorian bookcloth ended and publishers used different kinds of cloth, well, now those are publishers bindings too. So publishers binding is a bit more of an umbrella, depending on the kind of cloth that's used. Does that help?
Yeah, that actually makes sense. Tom asked, could you describe the colanders you mentioned? How large were they and what did they look like?
I can show you a picture.
I actually thought the same thing, because I was thinking of colanders like cooking colanders.
Yeah, I know. This is a British term.
Okay.
We call them rollers. Okay. Bill in his book. No, that's a mango. That's not good. They were huge. Okay, okay. This is a small one. If you can see it.
Bring it over the other way. Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Now
Oh,
the
okay.
problem, they're huge, because if remember that the cloth is what 30, probably 48 inches wide.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to be at least 48 inches. The problem with the colanders is Bill. Okay, here's a big one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This was an important industry. The problem with these colanders, Bill told me that he was looking for some all his life and he never found them. And he is pretty certain that they were literally all melted down during the war effort for their metal content.
Gotcha. Well, let me tell you, I don't know if you had time to look over at the chat, but you got many like congratulations. That was amazing, hugely impressive. So and it was oh, got another one here. Alicia Peterson, were the paintings and images added to these bindings done by hand? If so, did the binder object it for using these book cloth bindings? Did it increase the speed or lower the cost of production?
Is she speaking about something like this?
I think, yeah, with the paintings and images added, done by hand.
No, these are all printed by the publisher.
Okay.
Okay. The process would be they would take the boards, and the boards are the cardboard inside the book here. They would make a case, and the case would consist of two boards, the back board and the front board, and then in the they have a spine area. These would come, and they would be placed on. Well, first of all, they would have adhesive given to them. They would be placed on a piece of cloth, and then the corners turned over. Adhesive applied. The corners turned over, so you end up with basically a portfolio now: front board, back board, and the back. Then they would be printed, and in this case, they would be printed in black and blue and white. There, I see three colors here. I mean, other things could be all sorts of, but the printing came last. And then they would take the text block, which already had its mull on the back for the wings, and they would just put it into the glue it together, and there's your book. Does that help?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
One more question from John Windle. Which cloth trade binding is the most valuable in your experience?
I have no idea. I've never looked at them from a value standpoint. I suppose of all of the books that I have here in my collection, I would have to vote for this 1823 Moray for two reasons. One, okay, by the way, it's falling apart. By the other way, it is an English mystery book, but it's that original Moray binding before they engraved the colanders, and it seems to be earlier than anything Andrea has listed, unless she has updates that I don't know about. But 1823 is just about the time the whole thing started. So if I had to put a value on them, it would have to be this. But I don't know. I don't know if that makes any great difference. I think it was the content of the book. Oh, I would add that this book by Bill Tomlinson, Bookcloth, this is probably the very last book ever to be bound in Victorian bookcloth.
And have you ever seen a blue one?
I've never seen a blue one.
Do you think they ever made one?
I know Dorothy sold all of the blue cloth to the binder in Canterbury. This was published in 1996.
John Windle, I'd suggest the 1890s Pride and Prejudice in peacock design. See at the recent fair, saw at the recent fair for over £5,000. Okay.
I would bow to his expertise in a moment.
Okay. And Tucker Respis, mention that that Andrea's book is listed on Oak Knoll for $35. So it is
Good.
it's a must-have, I think, for anybody that has listened to this talk, because that is absolutely fascinating.
I would say if you could find Bill's book, the bookcloth book,
Mhm.
just because it has original samples in it, that
Yeah,
has its own value. But the two of them go together.
right.
But yes, Andrea's is the monumental work, and I don't know. I suppose when you sit there and think that she's trying to date things based on what she's finding, who knows what else is out there that she hasn't seen yet.
We all know that there's,
Right.
once, even if something's written in a book, we know that there's more to be had. Well, thank you so much, Jim. Thanks everybody for coming. That was fabulous. You had congratulations all over. So and just remember that this will be on our YouTube channel probably by tomorrow, the next day, the ABA YouTube channel. So if you've missed it, or if you know somebody who wants to look back and get some information, please check it out there.
Okay.
Thanks
Thank you
everyone
all.
for coming. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Have a great day.